The night they brought my sister-in-law back from the county annex building in Barfield, I was standing in Paula Godwin's kitchen, helping plate deviled eggs for the visitation. I had a piping bag in one hand and my phone in the other. And when Dale called, his voice was the kind of quiet that makes you set things down. He said, "Nora, you need to come to the funeral home." He said it twice. He didn't say why. I told Paula I had to go, and she didn't ask questions because she'd known Dale since he was 7 years old, same as everyone in Harkin, and she could hear through the phone that something had shifted in the order of things. I need to say a few things about Harkin, Georgia, because the town is not incidental to what happened. It is the thing that happened. Harkin is the county seat of Jessup County, population 2,800, give or take, depending on whether you're counting the folks who technically live outside the town limits but use the Harkin zip code. The courthouse sits on a square with a Confederate monument. They voted to move in 2021, and then didn't. The Baptist Church and the Methodist Church face each other across Tillman Street, like two old women who stopped speaking in 1987 and are too proud to start again. The Dollar General is out on the state highway. The funeral home Bowden Brothers, 3 generations, is on Clary Avenue, in a converted Victorian that still has the original pocket doors. Everyone knows everyone. That phrase gets thrown around about small towns like it's quaint, like it means you wave at the mailman and your neighbor brings you pie. What it actually means is that information is a shared resource, like well water. You don't own what you know. You hold it in common. And if you try to keep something to yourself, people can feel the weight of it. They can feel you holding. My husband's name is Curtis. His sister's name was Anne Marie. Anne Marie was 44 years old, and she died on a Tuesday in February at her home of what Doc Patton called a cardiac event. I say Doc Patton because that's what everyone calls him, though his name is Lewis Patton and he's the county coroner, which, in Jessup County, means he's an elected official with a funeral supply business and a 2-week training course he took in Atlanta 11 years ago. He is not a medical doctor. He's not a medical examiner. He's a man who ran for coroner because nobody else wanted to, and he won because his mother was on the county commission for 20 years, and his last name means something around here. This is legal in Georgia. This is normal in most of rural Georgia. I didn't think about it before Anna Marie, and now I can't stop. Anna Marie was found by her daughter Becca, who is 17. Becca came home from school and found her mother on the kitchen floor. She called 911. The volunteer EMTs came. They tried CPR. Doc Patton was called because that's the procedure if someone dies at home. The coroner comes. He came, he looked at her, he talked to the EMTs, he made the call. Time of death was estimated at some time that morning. Anna Marie had a history of arrhythmia. It wasn't shocking, just devastating. Curtis took it like a man who'd been preparing for something he didn't know he was preparing for. He went silent in a way that had texture to it, like a room where someone has just stopped playing the piano, and you can still feel the strings settling. The body went to the county annex building first, because Doc Patton said the paperwork needed to be processed before she could be released to Bowden Brothers. This was unusual, but not unheard of. The annex is a cinder block building behind the courthouse that serves as overflow storage, records archive, and, when necessary, a temporary holding facility for the coroner's office, which doesn't have its own proper morgue. Jessup County has never had the money to build one. They have a refrigerated unit in the annex basement, the kind you'd see in a restaurant supply catalog, and a stainless steel table that Terry Bowden once told me was purchased, used from a veterinary clinic in Macon. That's where they put Anna Marie. The transfer to Bowden Brothers was supposed to happen Wednesday morning. It didn't happen until Wednesday evening. When I asked Curtis why, he said Doc Patton had some paperwork backed up. When I asked Terry Bowden's wife, Lila, who I see every Thursday at the library board meeting, she changed the subject. Then Dale called me Thursday evening, while I was piping deviled eggs. Dale Bowden is Terry's younger brother. He does the transport and preparation at the funeral home. He's been doing it for 20 years. He is not a man given to exaggeration or drama. He once described a car accident he witnessed as That was something. And then didn't mention it again. So when I got to Bowden Brothers and found Dale sitting in the arrangement room with the lights off, I understood that whatever had happened was outside his categories. He told me that when he'd unzipped the transport bag to begin preparation of Anna Marie's body, he had seen her chest rise. Not twitch, not settle. Rise, hold, and fall, the way a chest does when a living person is breathing. He'd stood there for what he estimated was 90 seconds, watching, and it happened twice more. Then he'd put his hand under her nose and felt warmth. Then he'd called me, instead of 911, instead of Curtis, instead of Doc Patton. I asked him why he called me. He said, "Because you're the one in this family who asks follow-up questions." I said, "Dale, if she's breathing, we need to call an ambulance right now." And he said, "I did. I called you second. They're on the way. But I need you here, because something is wrong beyond the obvious thing that's wrong." I didn't understand what he meant until the EMTs arrived. 2 of them, Cody Walls, who coaches Little League with Curtis, and Janelle Ford, who cuts my hair. They went to Anna Marie. They checked vitals. They looked at each other. Then Cody came out to where Dale and I were standing in the hallway and said something that rearranged the architecture of the next 3 months of my life. He said, "She has a pulse. It's weak, but it's there." And then he said, "Nora, I was on the call Tuesday. I checked for a pulse. She did not have one." I said, "Could you have missed it?" And Cody's face did something I'd never seen it do. He looked afraid, but not of the situation, afraid of me, afraid of the question and what his answer would mean. He said, "I don't think so." They transported Anna Marie to Jessup County General, which is 18 miles away in Barfield. Not a large hospital, but a real one, with doctors who went to medical school and equipment that was manufactured for human beings. Curtis met us there. Becca was with him. I remember Becca's face in the emergency room lights. She looked like someone who had already reassembled herself after her mother's death and was now being told to take it all apart again. And the expression wasn't hope. It was something closer to fury. Anna Marie was alive. She was unconscious. Her body temperature was significantly below normal. Her heart rate was barely registering, but she was alive. The ER doctor, a woman named Meta, whom none of us had met before, ran tests for 4 hours. She asked questions about the timeline that we answered as accurately as we could. She asked who had pronounced the death. When Curtis said Doc Patton, she paused in a way that had weight, not surprise, something more practiced than surprise. She wrote something in the chart and then asked to speak with me privately. I don't know why she chose me. Maybe because I was the one standing closest. Maybe because Dale had been right, that I was the one asking questions. Maybe because Curtis and Becca were inside a kind of shock that doesn't have an opening for new information. Dr. Mehta asked me if Anna Marie had any history of drug use. I said no. She asked if Anna Marie had access to any medications that could lower heart rate and body temperature to the point of mimicking death. I said I didn't know. Then she said something careful. She said, "The presentation is consistent with a profound metabolic suppression. It could be an unusual physiological event. It could also be pharmacological. I want you to understand both possibilities before the situation develops further." I asked what she meant by develops further. She said, "I've already contacted the state medical examiner's office. This is a reportable event. A living person was declared dead and held in a non-medical facility for approximately 30 hours. There will be questions that are not mine to answer." She was right. There were questions. But before the questions arrived through official channels, they arrived the way everything arrives in Harkin. Through the network, the web of association and obligation and shared knowledge that constitutes life in a town where 2,800 people have been watching each other for generations. By Friday morning, everyone knew. Not the details, the fact. Anna Marie Kimball had been declared dead, and she wasn't dead. The town's reaction was not what I expected. I expected shock, maybe outrage, maybe a kind of fascinated horror. What I got instead was something I've spent months trying to name, and the closest I can come is this: the town circled. Not around Anna Marie, not around our family, around itself, around the structures that had produced the error. The first thing that happened was that Lila Bowden called me Saturday morning, before I'd even finished coffee, and told me that Terry wanted me to know that the Bowden brothers' funeral home had followed all proper procedures, and that the delay in transfer had been entirely on Doc Patton's end. She said this in a voice that was warm and helpful and contained, underneath the warmth, a load-bearing wall of preemptive self-defense. I thanked her and hung up. The second thing that happened was that Gail Patton, Doc Patton's wife, left a casserole on our porch with a card that said, "Praying for Anna Marie's full recovery," as though her husband had not been the one who looked at a living woman and called her dead. The casserole was still warm. The card was in Gail's handwriting, which I recognized because she'd written the calligraphy for the church directory for the last 15 years. The third thing that happened was that Pastor Mike from First Baptist called Curtis and asked him to consider waiting before he talked to anyone official. He said the word official, the way you'd say infected. He said the community needed time to understand the situation. He said Doc Patton was a good man who served the county faithfully. He said these things to my husband, whose sister had been zipped into a bag and placed on a veterinary table in a 40-degree room for 30 hours while her heart was still beating. Curtis hung up the phone and looked at me and said, "They're going to make this about Lewis." I said, "It is about Lewis. Who else is it about?" And Curtis said, "No, they're going to make it about protecting Lewis. That's different." He was right, and the distinction he was drawing became the central fact of everything that followed. The question was never whether Doc Patton had made a mistake. The question was what the town was prepared to let that mistake mean. Because if it meant that the coroner was incompetent, then it also meant that every death he'd certified in 11 years was potentially unreliable. It meant the families who'd buried people on his word might have buried them on insufficient authority. It meant that the county commission that had kept him in the role, and the voters who'd elected him, and the EMTs who'd deferred to his judgment, and the funeral home that had accepted his paperwork, it meant all of them were implicated, not legally maybe, but in the way that matters more in a town like Harkin, which is morally, socially, in the fabric of who trusts whom and why. So the town circled, and the circling looked like kindness. It looked like casseroles and phone calls and people stopping by the house to check on us and ask how Anna Marie was doing, and to mention, gently, that Doc Patton was just torn up about this, that he hadn't been sleeping, that his blood pressure was through the roof, that he might not run for re-election, as though his suffering were commensurate with Anna Marie's, as though his insomnia and her 30 hours of living burial occupied the same moral register. I want to be clear. I don't think these people were evil. I don't think they were consciously conspiring. I think they were doing what small towns do when a crack appears in the foundation they fill it with themselves. They pour their relationships and their history and their mutual dependency into the gap, and they press down until it holds. They do this because the alternative is to let the crack widen, and if the crack widens, they don't know what's underneath. Anna Marie regained consciousness on Sunday, 5 days after she'd been declared dead. She could speak, though not well. She was confused. She didn't remember Tuesday at all. The last thing she remembered clearly was Monday night, making Becca's lunch for the next day. Turkey on wheat, no tomato. She told us this detail and Becca left the room, and I heard her crying in the hallway. Not the crying of relief, but the crying of someone who has been given back something that's been changed in the giving. Dr. Mehta's toxicology results came back Monday. She called me, not Curtis, and I understood by then that she'd identified me as the conduit, the person in the family who could receive information without it detonating on contact. She told me that Anna Marie's blood work showed traces of a compound that was consistent with a class of drugs used in veterinary sedation. She said this flatly, without editorializing, but the silence after she said it was a kind of editorial in itself. I said, veterinary. She said, "Yes, the compound is not typically available for human use. It's used in large animal procedures. It can, in sufficient doses, suppress vital signs to a degree that could be mistaken for death by someone without proper medical training." I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for a long time after that call. I watched a man walk his dog across the grass median. I watched a cloud move over the building and shadow the lot and move on. I thought about the stainless steel table in the annex basement that had been purchased from a veterinary clinic. I thought about Doc Patton's funeral supply business and what else a man in that business might have access to. Then I stopped thinking about Doc Patton because the thought that was forming was too large and too terrible, and I wasn't ready for it yet. I called Curtis. I told him what Dr. Mehta had said. The silence on his end was different from his usual silence. It was the silence of someone doing math. He said, "Who would have access to that kind of drug?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Nora, who?" I said, "I don't know yet." And I meant it. I didn't know. But the list of people who might know was short, and every name on it was someone I saw at church, at the grocery store, at the 4th of July picnic, at Friday night football games. Every name on it was someone who'd know I was asking if I asked. The state medical examiner's office sent an investigator on Tuesday, 1 week after Anna Marie had been declared dead. His name was Orrin Gibbs. He was from Atlanta, a thin man with a patient face, and the particular manner of someone accustomed to being unwelcome. He set up in a conference room at the county courthouse and began requesting records. The town's response to Orrin Gibbs was a masterpiece of coordinated unhelpfulness that no one had to organize because the instinct was shared. Doc Patton was cooperative, but vague. He couldn't find certain paperwork. His records were handwritten, and some were at his home office, and some were at the annex, and some might have been in his truck. The EMTs Cody and Janelle and the others gave statements that were accurate but minimal. They described what they'd seen and what they'd done, and they did not speculate. Terry Bowden provided the transport logs and the preparation records and expressed his shock and his sympathy and his confidence that the system, while imperfect, was staffed by good people doing their best. Nobody lied. That's what I want you to understand. Nobody in Harkin lied to Orrin Gibbs. They just thinned the truth. They removed the connective tissue. They gave him facts without context, events without interpretation, details without the web of relationships that would have made those details speak. It was like handing someone a pile of bones and expecting them to understand the animal. I watched this happen from inside the community, not outside it. I was at the Thursday library board meeting when Lila Bowden said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that she hoped the state investigator would be respectful of people's time and not treat the whole town like suspects over what was clearly a medical anomaly. 6 heads nodded. I was one of them. I nodded because I was sitting in a room with people I'd known for 12 years, and the social current was flowing in one direction, and my body followed it before my mind could object. I went home and told Curtis what I'd done, and he said, "Yeah." And I could hear in that single word that he'd done versions of the same thing. That someone at the hardware store had said something about how Orrin Gibbs didn't understand how things worked here, and Curtis had made a non-committal sound that functioned as agreement. We were being woven into the response, not forcibly, not conspiratorially, just naturally, the way water follows the grade of the land. Becca was the one who broke it. She came to our house on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after Anna Marie had been moved to the hospital, and she had her mother's laptop. She put it on the kitchen table and opened it and turned it toward us and said, "I found something, and I don't know who else to show it." Anna Marie had been keeping a document. Not a diary, something more structured than that. It was a file on her desktop called Insurance, which is probably why nobody had looked at it, because who opens a file called Insurance on a dead woman's computer when her death appears natural? But Becca had been looking for the actual insurance information and had found this instead. The document was a record of interactions, dates, times, descriptions, going back 8 months. Anna Marie had been documenting a pattern of behavior by a man she referred to only as L, and it did not take any of us long to work out who L was. The entries described encounters that started as professional L, coming to the house for what Anne Marie described as a wellness check after her arrhythmia diagnosis, something that was not within a coroner's duties, but that Doc Patton apparently offered as a courtesy to residents he knew personally, which in Harkin meant everyone. The entries progressed. L began visiting more frequently. L brought medications he said would help with her heart. L made comments that Anna Marie recorded with the flat precision of someone who knows she's building a case. L told her that her condition was more serious than her doctor in Barfield understood. L told her she should let him manage it locally so she wouldn't have to make the drive. L told her she was lucky to have someone looking out for her. The last entry was dated the Friday before Anna Marie collapsed. It said, L came again. I told him I was going to talk to Dr. Ware about the pills. He got quiet in a way I haven't seen before. He said that would be a mistake. He said Dr. Ware wouldn't understand the local formulation. That's the phrase he used. Local formulation. I don't know what that means, but I'm writing it down. Curtis read the whole thing without speaking. Then he closed the laptop and put both his hands flat on the table and pressed down like he was trying to keep the table from moving. Becca watched him. I watched both of them. The kitchen was very quiet. Curtis said, "We have to give this to Gibbs." I said, "Yes." Becca said, "Mom is going to have to know." And that was the moment I understood the actual shape of the dilemma we were inside. It wasn't about whether to turn over evidence. Of course we'd turn it over. It was about what would happen in the town when we did, and who we would be afterward, and who we would be to each other. Because this document didn't just implicate Doc Patton. It implicated the entire structure that had allowed a man with a 2-week training certificate and access to veterinary pharmaceuticals to serve as the sole authority on death in a county of 11,000 people. It implicated the people who'd elected him, the commission that had funded, or rather, not funded, a real coroner's office, the EMTs who'd deferred to his pronouncement, the funeral home that hadn't questioned a 30-hour hold. It implicated all of us, everyone in Harkin who'd accepted the arrangement because it was familiar, and because Lewis Patton's mother had been on the commission, and because that's just how it works here. I called Orrin Gibbs that night. He answered on the second ring, even though it was after 10. I think he'd been waiting for a call like this. I think he'd known, from the quality of the silence he'd been getting, that someone in the town was going to break, and he was just waiting to find out who. We met him at the courthouse the next morning. Curtis brought the laptop. Becca came. She sat between us, which I think was deliberate. She was positioning herself as part of this action, not a child being represented by adults. She was 17, and she had found the document, and she wanted Gibbs to know that. Gibbs read the file. He took a long time. He asked clarifying questions about Anna Marie's medical history, about Doc Patton's visits, about the pills. We answered what we could. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. He said, "Has anyone else in the community seen this document?" Curtis said, "No." Gibbs said, "When you leave this building, people are going to know you were here. In this town, from what I can tell, that's the same as them, knowing what you said. Are you prepared for that?" Curtis looked at Becca. Becca looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't include me, and that was correct. This was their family's body on the table, their mother and sister, and whatever they decided would cost them more than it cost me. Becca said, "My mom is alive because Dale Bowden unzipped that bag. I don't care who knows I'm here." We left the courthouse at 11 in the morning. By noon, Gail Patton had called Curtis to ask what was going on. He didn't answer. By 1, Pastor Mike had called me. I didn't answer. By 2, Lila Bowden had left a voicemail, asking if everything was all right, her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who already knows it isn't and is scouting the terrain. By evening, the texture of Harkin had changed. I could feel it when I went to the grocery store. Not hostility, not yet. Something more like a vibration, a shared alertness, the way a flock of birds adjusts in unison before any single bird moves. People were polite. People asked about Anne-Marie. But underneath the asking was a different question, and the question was, what did you tell him? The next 6 weeks were the worst of my life, and I've had some bad weeks. I had a miscarriage in 2019 that put me in the hospital. I lost my father to a stroke when I was 26. But those were griefs that the community absorbed and helped me carry. This was different. This was a grief that the community had authored and did not want to own. And when we tried to make them own it, they set us down. Not all at once, not dramatically, just set us down. Curtis's friend Ray, who he'd hunted with every November for 15 years, started being busy when Curtis called. The woman who ran the after-school program where Becca volunteered told her, gently, that they had enough helpers for now. I went to the library board meeting and the conversation stopped when I walked in, and when it resumed, it was about nothing. They talked about nothing for an hour and a half, and I sat there and listened to the nothing and understood that the nothing was for me. The nothing was the shape of my exclusion. I want to be specific, because the mechanism matters. Nobody said, "We are punishing you for cooperating with the state investigator." Nobody used those words. What happened was subtler and, I think, more honest. The town was an organism, and we had introduced a foreign agent, and the organism was responding the way organisms do by isolating the point of entry. We were the wound. The town was trying to close around us. Anne-Marie was recovering, slowly, with setbacks, but recovering. She was transferred to a hospital in Augusta for neurological evaluation because the prolonged hypothermia and metabolic suppression had done some damage that the doctors in Barfield weren't equipped to assess. She had trouble with words sometimes. She'd reach for a noun and get an adjective instead, and you could see her frustration like a physical thing, a clenching behind her eyes. But she was alive and she was getting better and she remembered more each day, and what she remembered confirmed what the document described, though she filled in dimensions the document couldn't. She told us that she had trusted Lewis Patton, that he'd been kind to her after her diagnosis, that the pills he'd brought had, at first, made her feel better, calmer, steadier, less aware of the irregular rhythm that had terrified her since the cardiologist in Barfield had explained what it meant. She said he visited every week, then twice a week. She said he took her blood pressure with a cuff he carried in his bag and told her the numbers were improving. She said she'd started to feel strange, heavy, slow, like her body was running at the wrong speed, and when she told him, he said that was the medication working, that it was slowing her heart to protect it. She said she'd begun to wonder, in the last few weeks, whether something was wrong, whether the medication was doing what he said it was doing. She said she'd decided to ask Dr. Ware in Barfield for a second opinion, and she'd told Lewis this, and his face had done something she described as going flat, like a window closing, she said. Like he was there and then he was behind something. The last thing she remembered was Tuesday morning. She'd taken the pill he'd left for her. She'd been making coffee. Then nothing. Until the hospital, days later, with tubes in her arms and her daughter's face above her, and the face was wrong. Anne-Marie said. Becca's face was wrong. It was older than it should have been. Orrin Gibbs built his case. He did it methodically, without hurry, and without any expectation of help from Harkin. He subpoenaed Doc Patton's records, such as they were. He subpoenaed the purchase records from veterinary supply companies in a 4-county radius. He had Anne-Marie's remaining pills analyzed. He consulted with veterinary pharmacologists. He coordinated with the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and at some point the case crossed a threshold from administrative inquiry into criminal investigation. Doc Patton was arrested on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Anne-Marie had been declared dead, charged with aggravated assault, practicing medicine without a license, and this one, I hadn't anticipated tampering with a public record, because his coroner's report on Anne-Marie was, in legal terms, a falsified government document, whether he'd known she was alive when he wrote it or not. The arrest happened at the courthouse. Cody Walls told me later that Lewis had walked out with the GBI agents quietly, without handcuffs, and that his face had the expression of someone who'd been expecting a bill and had finally received it. The town watched. I don't mean that figuratively. People stood on the sidewalks around the square and watched Lewis Patton get into the back of a state vehicle. And the silence was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of something being acknowledged that everyone had already known but had agreed not to say. Because here is what came out. In the weeks after the arrest, through the investigation and the depositions and the slow, grinding process of legal accountability, people had known, not the specifics. Not that Lewis Patton was administering veterinary sedatives to a woman in her home, but that something about Lewis wasn't right, that his authority exceeded his competence, that his visits to certain residents, particularly women, particularly those living alone, particularly those with chronic conditions, had a frequency and an intimacy that didn't match his role. 3 other women came forward after the arrest. Their stories were less dramatic than Anna Marie's no false death declarations, no 30 hours in a refrigerated room, but they described the same pattern. The visits, the medications, the slow accumulation of dependency, the subtle discouragement from seeking outside care. And people had known. Fragments, suspicions, the kind of partial knowledge that a small town generates constantly and absorbs without acting on. Lila Bowden had once said to me, years ago, at a library board meeting, that she thought Lewis was too involved with some of his cases. And I'd nodded, and we'd moved on to discussing the summer reading program. Janelle Ford, the EMT who cuts my hair, told me after the arrest that she'd questioned Lewis's competence on a call 3 years ago and been told by her supervisor that Lewis was the coroner and it wasn't her place. Gail Patton, Lewis's own wife, reportedly told a friend that Lewis kept supplies at home that she didn't understand the purpose of, and the friend had told another friend, and that friend had thought about mentioning it to someone on the county commission but hadn't because it was secondhand and it would cause trouble, and Lewis was a good man, and Gail was probably just worried about nothing. Every one of these fragments, by itself, was nothing. A shrug, a fleeting concern. The kind of thing you think about for 10 minutes and then let go, because the effort of pursuing it is so much greater than the effort of letting it pass. And because pursuing it means disrupting relationships that you depend on for your daily life, and because you might be wrong, and if you're wrong, you've caused harm to a good person for nothing. But together, the fragments were a map. They described the exact territory of Lewis Patton's predation, and the territory was legible, and nobody had read it, because reading it required stepping outside the system that made life in Harkin functional. And nobody was willing to do that until the cost of not doing it arrived in the form of a living woman in a body bag. This is what I need to say, and what I don't know how to say cleanly. The horror of what happened to Anna Marie is not that a bad man did a bad thing. Bad men do bad things everywhere. The horror is that the town's goodness, its genuine, functional, sustaining goodness, the goodness of casseroles and phone calls and volunteers and shared knowledge and mutual care, was the instrument of his concealment. The same web of relationships that would mobilize to help a neighbor after a house fire also mobilized to absorb and dissipate the signals that a neighbor was being slowly poisoned. The mechanism was identical. The love and the failure were the same gesture. I think about this when I can't sleep, which is most nights. I think about the deviled eggs I was piping when Dale called. I think about the casserole Gail Patton left on our porch. I think about nodding at the library board meeting when Lila said she hoped the state investigator would be respectful. I think about every moment I participated in the circling, every moment my body followed the social current before my mind could object. And I try to locate the exact point where my complicity became distinct from my community membership. And I can't find it. I cannot find the seam. That's what terrifies me. Not Lewis Patton. Lewis Patton is in a county jail awaiting trial, and he will, I believe, go to prison for a long time. What terrifies me is that the thing that enabled him, is the same thing I depend on for my life to make sense. And I don't know how to keep one without the other. Anna Marie is home now. She lives with Becca in the same house. She has residual neurological effects. The word-finding difficulty has improved, but not resolved. And she has a tremor in her left hand that her doctors say may be permanent. She goes to a cardiologist in Augusta every 6 weeks, a real cardiologist. And she takes medications that come from a pharmacy with a license number and a pharmacist whose name is on the bottle. She is alive, and she is angry, and her anger is precise, and she directs it not at Lewis Patton, but at the town, at the organism, at the structure of mutual obligation that kept her inside a room she couldn't see the walls of until she woke up in a hospital and was told she'd been dead for 30 hours. Becca graduated high school in May. She's going to college in Savannah. She told me, the day she got her acceptance, that she was never coming back to Harkin. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact, the way you'd say the distance between two cities. I didn't argue with her. Curtis and I are still here. We are still in the web. People are polite to us again. The acute phase of our exclusion lasted about 3 months. And then, as the legal process moved Lewis Patton from local scandal to state criminal case, the town's posture shifted. The narrative reformed. Lewis became an aberration rather than a product. People began saying things like, "Nobody could have known," and "He fooled everyone." And these statements were both true and untrue in a way that I've given up trying to correct. Because correcting it would require me to say, "He didn't fool you. You chose not to look." And saying that to people, I need people who teach my hypothetical future children, who plow my road in winter, who will bring food to my house when I grieve, saying that would be its own kind of violence. And I'm not sure I have the right. The county commission appointed a new interim coroner. She's a retired nurse from Barfield. She has actual medical training. The commission also approved a budget request for equipment upgrades at the annex, which I suppose is progress, though it means they're still using the annex. And every time I drive past that cinder block building, I think about the refrigerated unit in the basement, and the stainless steel table, and the 30 hours. I go to the library board meetings. I wave to Lila Bowden. I make small talk with Janelle Ford when she cuts my hair. I participate in the web because the web is where I live, and leaving would mean becoming someone I don't recognize. And staying means accepting that the thing I'm woven into is capable of absorbing a woman's slow poisoning and near death, and calling it a tragedy that nobody could have predicted. Dale Bowden and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes, when I see him at the store or at church, he looks at me with an expression that I think is the same one I see in the mirror, which is the expression of someone who unzipped something and found it breathing when it should have been still, and who understands that the something is not just Anna Marie. The something is the town itself. The town is the body in the bag. It has been still for a long time. It is not dead. It is waiting for someone to check, and nobody wants to put their hand under its nose, because what they'll feel there will obligate them to act, and acting will mean admitting that the stillness was never peace. It was just the quiet of a room where everyone agreed not to listen for a heartbeat. I'm telling you this because Becca asked me to. She said, "Someone outside Harkin should know what it's like inside Harkin." She said, "Write it down and give it to someone who doesn't owe anyone here anything." So I'm writing it down. I don't know if it's for warning or for testimony or for something I can't name yet. I know it's true. I know Anna Marie is alive. I know Lewis Patton is awaiting trial. I know the deviled eggs got finished eventually. Paula Godwin did them, and they were served at the visitation for a woman who was, at that moment, breathing in a refrigerated room, and everyone ate them. And everyone said they were good.